The death rattle of gunfire from the outlaw's pistol still echoed in Piper Meadows' ears as she stumbled through the jagged terrain of the Wyoming Territory, her dress torn and mudded from days of desperate flight. It was 1876, the nation's centennial year, though there was nothing celebratory about her current predicament. Blood from a shallow bullet graze on her arm had dried to a rusty brown, and the fever that had started as a whisper the previous day now screamed through her body with merciless intensity. Piper had been traveling west with her aunt and uncle when their stagecoach was attacked 3 days ago. The memory of their lifeless bodies slumped against the coach seats haunted her waking moments. She alone had escaped while the bandits were looting the baggage, fleeing into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and her aunt's locket pressed against her collarbone. The vast, indifferent landscape of sagebrush and distant mountains swam before her eyes as she trudged forward. Each step became more laborious than the last, her legs barely able to support her trembling frame. The summer sun beat down relentlessly, drawing precious moisture from her already parched body. "Water," she whispered, her cracked lips barely able to form the word. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and the fever made her head pound with each heartbeat. When she heard the distant rumble of wagon wheels, Piper wasn't sure if it was real or a hallucination born of desperation. She turned toward the sound, squinting against the harsh light. A covered wagon approached along a rutted trail she hadn't noticed in her delirium. With the last reserves of her strength, she stumbled toward it, waving her arms weakly. "Help," she called out, but her voice was a mere whisper carried away by the prairie wind. The wagon drew closer, and Piper could make out a tall figure holding the reins. As the distance between them narrowed, her legs finally gave way. She collapsed to her knees, then slumped forward onto the dusty ground, consciousness slipping away as the sound of hurried footsteps approached. Hank Xavier had been hauling supplies back to his homestead when he spotted the woman. At first, he thought she might be a mirage. It wouldn't be the first time the Wyoming wilderness played tricks on a man's eyes. But as he drew closer, he realized with alarm that she was very real and in serious trouble. "Whoa there," he called to his team of horses, pulling them to a stop. He jumped down from the wagon seat, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. In long strides, he reached the collapsed woman and knelt beside her. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with hair the color of wheat that had come loose from what must have once been a neat arrangement. Her dress, though filthy and torn, was of good quality. This was no vagrant or working girl, but a lady who had clearly endured something terrible. Gently, Hank turned her over. Her skin burned with fever beneath his calloused hands, and her breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. A dried streak of blood on her sleeve told him she was injured as well. "Miss, can you hear me?" he asked. Though he didn't expect an answer from her unconscious form, with practiced ease, Hank lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, and he could feel her body trembling even in unconsciousness. He carried her to his wagon and carefully placed her on the padded bench seat, then climbed up beside her. With a flick of the reins, he set the horses in motion, urging them to a pace faster than he would normally risk on the rough terrain. "Hang on, miss," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "My place ain't far." Hank's homestead came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, a modest but sturdy cabin with a small barn nearby, nestled in a protected valley with a clear stream running nearby. He'd built it with his own hands after returning from the war between the states, determined to make a life for himself away from the crowded cities of the East. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the cabin door and again gathered the unconscious woman into his arms. Inside, he carried her directly to his bed, the only one in the single-room cabin. It was a simple wooden frame with a straw-filled mattress covered by a patchwork quilt his mother had made before she died. As he laid her down, her eyelids fluttered briefly, but she didn't wake. Hank touched her forehead. The fever still raged. Moving with efficiency born of necessity, a man living alone on the frontier learned to tend to his own needs. He gathered clean cloths, his basin, and fresh water from the barrel by the door. First, he needed to cool her down. He soaked a cloth in the cool water and placed it on her forehead, then carefully began to examine her for injuries. The wound on her arm was thankfully shallow, though inflamed around the edges. A bullet graze, he suspected, having seen enough of them during the war. After cleaning and bandaging the wound, Hank pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down, unsure what more he could do for her. She continued to tremble despite the blanket he'd drawn over her, and her breathing remained quick and shallow. "What happened to you?" He wondered aloud, studying her face. Though dirty and pale with illness, she was undeniably beautiful, with delicate features and full lips that were chapped from dehydration. Hank dipped another cloth in water and gently moistened her lips. She responded instinctively, her tongue darting out to capture the precious moisture. Taking this as an encouraging sign, Hank lifted her head slightly and pressed a cup of water to her lips. "Drink," he urged, "just a little." To his relief, she swallowed reflexively, taking in a small amount of water before turning her head away. Hank settled back in his chair, resigned to a long night of watching over his unexpected guest. As darkness fell, he lit a lamp and continued his vigil, changing the cool compress on her forehead regularly. Occasionally, he would coax a few more sips of water into her, but otherwise, there was little change in her condition. "You're safe now," he told her as the night deepened around them. "Whatever trouble found you out there, it can't reach you here." The sound of his deep voice seemed to calm her restless movements, so Hank continued to talk, telling her about his homestead, his horses, and the life he'd built for himself in this remote corner of the Wyoming Territory. He spoke of his dreams for the future, expanding his small herd of cattle, perhaps adding another room to the cabin. It had been a long time since Hank had spoken so much, living as he did in solitude for weeks at a time. The words felt strange in his mouth, but somehow right. As if this unconscious woman was meant to hear them, even if she wouldn't remember. Around midnight, she began to stir more actively, her head tossing on the pillow as fever dreams took hold. She murmured incoherently, occasionally crying out in apparent fear. Hank took her hand in his, surprised by how natural it felt to offer this small comfort to a stranger. "Shh," he soothed. "You're not alone." Her fingers tightened around his, and for a moment her eyes opened unfocused and bright with fever, but open nonetheless. She looked at him without recognition, then slipped back into restless sleep, still holding his hand. Hank remained that way until dawn broke, his back stiff from hours in the wooden chair, but unwilling to break the connection that seemed to bring her comfort. As the first light of morning filtered through the cabin's single window, the woman's fever finally broke. Hank felt the change in her skin, still warm, but no longer burning, and saw the easing of tension in her features. Her breathing deepened and slowed to a more natural rhythm. Carefully, Hank extracted his hand from hers and stood to stretch his cramped muscles. He needed to tend to his animals and prepare something more substantial than water for when she awakened. Before leaving the cabin, he paused to look back at her, struck by how right she looked in his bed, as if a space had been waiting for her all along. It was nearly noon when Piper finally opened her eyes. For several moments, she stared at the unfamiliar log ceiling, trying to piece together fragmented memories. The stagecoach attack, running, the terrible thirst and fever, and then, nothing. She attempted to sit up but found herself too weak to manage it. The movement caused a dull pain in her arm, and she looked down to discover a clean bandage where she remembered the bullet had grazed her. "Where am I?" she wondered aloud, her voice a raspy whisper. "My home," came a deep voice from across the room. Piper turned her head toward the sound and saw a tall man rising from a chair by a small table. He approached slowly, as if afraid of startling her, and Piper had a moment to take in his appearance. He wore the practical clothes of a working man: denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal sinewy forearms, and a leather vest. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with several days' worth of stubble shadowing a strong jaw. But it was his eyes that held her attention, a clear, steady blue that met hers without wavering. "My name's Hank Xavier," he said, stopping a respectful distance from the bed. "Found you collapsed near the trail yesterday. You've been pretty sick with fever." Piper licked her dry lips. "Water, please," she managed. Hank moved immediately to pour water from a pitcher into a cup, then helped her sit up enough to drink. His hands were large and rough with calluses, but they supported her with surprising gentleness. After she had drunk her fill, Piper sank back against the pillow. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier. I'm Piper Meadows." "Just Hank is fine," he replied. "And you're welcome, Miss Meadows. Though I reckon you might want to tell me what a lady like yourself was doing wandering alone in this territory. It's not exactly safe country." The memories rushed back: the ambush, the terror, the desperate flight. Piper closed her eyes against sudden tears. "Our stagecoach was attacked 3 days ago. My aunt and uncle, they were killed. I ran while the bandits were distracted. I've been trying to reach the next town, but I got lost, and then the fever started." Her voice broke, and to her surprise, Hank sat down on the edge of the bed and awkwardly patted her hand. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Meadows. That's a terrible thing to endure." The simple kindness in his words broke something loose inside her, and Piper found herself weeping openly, releasing the fear and grief she'd been holding at bay during her desperate flight. Hank sat quietly, offering his presence as comfort until her tears subsided. "I've made some stew," he said when she had composed herself. "Think you could manage a bit? You need to get your strength back." Piper nodded, suddenly aware of the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Hank helped her sit up more fully, arranging pillows behind her back, then brought over a bowl of rich-smelling stew and a spoon. To her embarrassment, her hands trembled too much to hold the spoon steadily. Without comment, Hank took it from her and began to feed her, his movements matter-of-fact, as if helping a strange woman eat was something he did every day. "This is very good," Piper said after a few bites, feeling color return to her cheeks as the nourishing food did its work. "Nothing fancy," Hank replied with a modest shrug. "Just rabbit with some wild onions and a few herbs I grow out back." "You live here alone?" Piper asked, glancing around the cabin. It was simple but clean and well-ordered, with a cooking area on one side, the bed she occupied in a corner, and a table with 2 chairs in the center. Various tools hung from pegs on the walls, and a rifle stood propped by the door. "Just me," Hank confirmed. "And the livestock, of course. Got a few head of cattle, 2 horses, some chickens. Enough to keep me busy." "It must be lonely," Piper observed, then immediately wished she could take back the overly personal comment, but Hank didn't seem offended. He considered her words as he offered another spoonful of stew. "I suppose it is at times, but I had my fill of crowds during the war. The quiet suits me now." "You fought in the war?" Piper asked, grateful for the change of subject. Hank nodded. "Union cavalry. Afterwards, I couldn't see myself going back east to Philadelphia. Too many ghosts there. So I came west, staked my claim, and built this place." "It's very nice," Piper said sincerely. "You've done well for yourself." A ghost of a smile touched Hank's lips. "Kind of you to say so. It's not much compared to what you're probably used to." "I think recent events have significantly adjusted my standards for comfort," Piper replied with a wry smile of her own. "A safe place to sleep and food in my stomach seem like luxuries beyond price right now." Hank studied her for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "You can stay here until you're well enough to travel, Miss Meadows. The nearest town, Riverton, is a day's ride away. I can take you there when you're stronger." "That's very generous," Piper said, feeling both grateful and strangely disappointed at the thought of leaving so soon. "But please call me Piper. After all, you've seen me at my worst and cared for me regardless. I think that puts us beyond formalities." "Piper," Hank repeated, as if testing how the name felt. He nodded. "It suits you." After she had eaten as much as she could manage, Hank took the bowl away and returned with a clean nightgown. "This was my mother's," he explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "I kept a few of her things. It might be big on you, but it's clean." "Thank you," Piper said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I would appreciate a change of clothes, but—" She hesitated, suddenly aware of her helplessness. Understanding dawned in Hank's eyes and a flush crept up his neck. "I'll step outside while you change. Call when you're decent, and I'll help with the buttons if needed." True to his word, Hank left the cabin, giving Piper privacy to struggle out of her ruined dress and into the simple cotton nightgown. It was indeed too large, but the clean fabric felt heavenly against her skin. The effort of changing exhausted her, and she lay back against the pillows, calling weakly for Hank to return. He came back in, his gaze carefully averted until she assured him she was properly covered. "The back buttons," she admitted. "I couldn't reach them." With surprising deftness, Hank fastened the few buttons at the back of the nightgown's collar, his fingertips brushing against her neck and sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Thank you," she murmured, suddenly aware of his physical presence in a way she hadn't been before. Perhaps it was because she was more lucid now, or perhaps it was the intimate nature of his assistance. But Piper found herself noticing details she had missed earlier: the clean, outdoor scent of him, the precise way he moved, the controlled strength in his hands. "You should rest now," Hank said, stepping back. "Your body's been through a lot." Piper nodded, already feeling sleep pulling at her. "Will you stay?" she asked, then clarified hastily. "I mean in the cabin. I don't want to keep you from your work." "I'll be here," Hank assured her. "Got some mending to do anyway." As Piper drifted off to sleep, her last image was of Hank settling into a chair by the table, a torn shirt and needle in his hands, his presence a comforting anchor in a world that had so recently been turned upside down. The next several days established a rhythm as Piper slowly regained her strength. Hank would rise at dawn to tend to his animals and outside chores, returning to the cabin to prepare breakfast, which they would share at the small table. Piper, having progressed to being able to sit up and even walk short distances with Hank's steady arm to lean on. During the day, while Hank worked around the homestead, Piper would rest or sit in a chair by the window, watching the wild beauty of Wyoming unfold before her. In the evenings, they would talk, their conversations growing deeper and more personal as their comfort with each other increased. Piper learned that Hank had come from a modest family in Philadelphia, that he had a younger sister still living there who wrote to him occasionally, and that he had originally planned to become a blacksmith before the war changed his path. In turn, she told him about growing up in Boston, about losing her parents to influenza when she was 16, and about her aunt and uncle who had taken her in afterward. They were traveling to San Francisco, she explained one evening as they sat by the fire Hank had built to ward off the night's chill. "Uncle Henry had business interests there. They invited me along because they thought the change of scenery would be good for me." She stared into the flames. "I never imagined it would end as it did." "You couldn't have known," Hank said quietly. "And you survived, Piper. That counts for something?" She looked up at him, struck by the simple wisdom in his words. "Yes, I suppose it does." As the days passed, Piper found herself watching Hank when he wasn't aware the way he moved with efficiency and purpose. The rare but transformative smile that would sometimes light his features, the gentleness he showed to his animals and to her. She had never met a man like him: direct, unaffected, competent in all the ways that mattered in this untamed land. For his part, Hank found himself extending Piper's convalescence in his mind. Each morning, he would assess her improved condition and think, "Perhaps tomorrow I'll offer to take her to town." But each evening, as they shared conversation by the fire, he would silently grant her another day of recovery. The truth, which he was reluctant to admit even to himself, was that he was in no hurry to see her go. Having Piper in his home had awakened something in him that he had thought long buried: a desire for companionship, for the simple pleasure of having someone to talk with at the end of the day, someone whose smile could brighten a room and make his solitary cabin feel like a home. A week after Hank had found her, Piper stepped outside the cabin for the first time. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine. Hank stood beside her, ready to offer support if needed, but Piper found her legs steady beneath her. "It's beautiful," she said, gazing at the sweeping landscape of rolling hills, distant mountains, and vast sky that surrounded the homestead. "It grows on you," Hank agreed. "Wasn't sure I'd stay when I first arrived. Seemed too big, too empty, but now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Piper nodded, understanding. There was a majesty to this land that called to something deep within her. "Show me around," she asked, surprising herself with the request. "I'd like to see what you've built here." Hank's face lit with a rare, full smile. "I'd be honored." He offered her his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him as they walked slowly around the homestead. Hank showed her the barn where he kept his horses and the small herd of cattle that grazed on the hillside. He pointed out the chicken coop he'd recently expanded and the vegetable garden that provided much of his food. "And over there," he said, gesturing to a cleared area beyond the barn, "is where I plan to build a proper corral next spring. The herd's growing and I need more space for breaking the young horses." "You plan to stay then," Piper observed, "to keep building here?" Hank looked at her, something unreadable in his blue eyes. "It's home," he said simply, "only one I've got." As they completed their circuit of the homestead, Piper found herself reluctant to return indoors despite her still recovering strength. "Could we sit outside for a while?" she asked, indicating a rough-hewn bench placed under a cottonwood tree near the cabin. "Of course," Hank replied, leading her to the bench and settling beside her, a respectful distance between them. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Piper was acutely aware of Hank beside her, his steady breathing, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his hands rested easily on his thighs. "I should thank you properly," she said eventually, turning to face him. "For saving my life, for caring for me, for—" She gestured vaguely, "all of this." Hank shook his head. "No thanks needed. Anybody would have done the same." "No," Piper said firmly. "Not anyone. What you've done goes beyond common decency, Hank. You've been kind in ways I couldn't have expected." He looked away, seemingly uncomfortable with her praise. "It's been no hardship," he said quietly, "having you here." The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Piper felt her heart quicken, though whether from boldness or fear she couldn't say. "I've been thinking," she began hesitantly, "about what happens next." Hank turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. "You're well enough to travel to town now if that's what you want. I could take you tomorrow." "Is that what you want?" Piper asked, surprising herself with her directness. A muscle worked in Hank's jaw as he considered her question. "What I want doesn't factor into it," he said finally. "You have a life waiting for you somewhere, people who will be worried, proper society." "My life, as it was, ended when that stagecoach was attacked," Piper replied, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "My aunt and uncle were my only family. I was traveling with them to start anew in San Francisco, but I have no connections there, no one expecting me." "Still," Hank persisted, "a woman like you belongs somewhere with opportunities, culture, other people, not isolated on a homestead with a man you barely know." Piper felt a flash of irritation at his assumptions. "A woman like me, and what kind of woman do you think I am, Hank Xavier?" He looked taken aback by her tone. "I meant no offense, just that you're educated, refined, used to certain comforts. And you think that means I can't appreciate what you've built here, that I can't see the value in a life lived honestly on your own terms." Piper shook her head. "You underestimate me." "Maybe I do," Hank conceded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Wouldn't be the first time I've misjudged a situation." Piper took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I don't know what my future holds now. Everything I planned has been swept away." But I do know that in the past week, despite the circumstances, I've felt more at peace than I have in years. There's a clarity here, a purpose that speaks to me." Hank studied her face as if searching for the truth behind her words. "What are you saying, Piper?" "I'm saying that I'm not ready to leave," she replied, her voice soft but determined. "Not yet. If you're willing, I'd like to stay a while longer, to help around the homestead, to see if this life might suit me as it suits you." "It's a hard life," Hank warned, though Piper could hear the hope beneath his caution. "Winters are brutal, comforts are few, and people would talk. A single woman living with a man who's not her kin." "Then perhaps we should give them something proper to talk about," Piper suggested, her heart pounding at her own boldness. Hank's eyes widened. "Piper, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," she interrupted. "I'm offering. Not a hasty decision, Hank. Just the possibility of something more, given time, the chance to see if what I feel growing between us might flourish." For a long moment, Hank was silent, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate care, he reached out and took her hand in his. "I've been alone a long time," he said quietly. "Got used to it, told myself it was enough, but having you here—" He paused, searching for words. "It's like finding something I didn't know I'd lost." Piper felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes at his simple, heartfelt confession. "Then let me stay," she whispered. "Let us see what might grow here, alongside your garden and your herd." Instead of answering with words, Hank leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, he pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Piper responded with a certainty that surprised her, her hand rising to rest against his cheek as the kiss deepened. When they finally parted, Hank rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "Stay," he said simply, "for as long as you wish." "And if I wish to stay forever?" Piper asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank pulled back slightly to look into her eyes, and the smile that transformed his features was like sunrise breaking over the Wyoming hills. "Then I'd say God has blessed me beyond all deserving." 3 months later, Piper stood in the doorway of their cabin, for it was theirs now, in every way that mattered, watching as Hank worked with a young horse in the newly completed corral. Fall had painted the landscape in golds and russets, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter to come. They had been married 2 months earlier, riding together to Riverton where the circuit preacher had performed a simple ceremony. The townsfolk had been curious about the Boston lady who had chosen life with a solitary rancher, but their skepticism had quickly given way to acceptance when they saw how Piper and Hank looked at each other. Life on the homestead wasn't easy. Piper's hands, once soft and unblemished, now bore calluses from work. She had learned to cook on an open hearth, to tend chickens, to preserve food for the coming winter. Each new skill was a victory, each challenge overcome a source of quiet pride. But the greatest joy was the partnership she and Hank had forged. They worked together during the day, shared their thoughts in the evening, and at night discovered the deep pleasure of belonging completely to one another. The bed where Hank had once laid her fevered body now witnessed a different kind of fire, one that burned steady and true between two people who had found each other against all odds. As Piper watched, Hank finished his work with the horse and turned toward the cabin. When he spotted her in the doorway, his face lit with the smile that never failed to make her heart skip. He crossed to her in long strides and swept her into an embrace, lifting her feet off the ground and spinning her once before setting her down. "What was that for?" Piper laughed, her arms still around his neck. "Because I can," Hank replied, dropping a kiss on her nose. "Because you're here. Because even after all these months, I still wake up wondering if I dreamed you." Piper pressed her palm to his cheek, feeling the rough stubble against her skin. "Not a dream," she assured him, "though sometimes it feels like one." "A good dream," Hank agreed, leading her inside where stew bubbled over the fire and fresh bread waited on the table, evidence of Piper's growing domestic skills. As they sat down to their meal, Piper reached across the table to take Hank's hand. "I have news," she said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. Hank looked up, a question in his eyes. "Doctor." "Morton confirmed it when we were in town yesterday," Piper continued, placing her free hand over her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Hank, next spring." For a moment, Hank sat perfectly still, his expression one of stunned disbelief. Then, with a whoop that startled the cat dozing by the fire, he was out of his chair and around the table, pulling Piper to her feet and into his arms. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby," Piper nodded, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Our family." Hank cradled her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "When I found you on that trail, sick and alone, I thought I was saving you," he said softly. "I never imagined you were actually saving me." "Perhaps we saved each other," Piper suggested, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. As the kiss deepened, Piper marveled at the journey that had brought her here, from the tragedy of the stagecoach attack to the fever that had nearly claimed her life, to this moment of perfect happiness in the arms of a man who had once been a stranger. She had been sick and shaking in his wagon until a cowboy carried her to his bed and sat beside her. And in that simple act of kindness, both their lives had been forever changed, forging a love as vast and enduring as the Wyoming sky above them.